My beloved child, something shifted quietly when your soulmate finally noticed that one detail they had been overlooking for far too long, and what makes this moment different is that nobody had to convince them of anything. There was no dramatic confrontation, no loud accusation, no sudden demand for answers. It happened in an ordinary moment, the kind that would have seemed meaningless to anyone else. Your soulmate was thinking back over a conversation, replaying certain words in their mind, when something simply stopped making sense. A sentence they had once accepted without question suddenly sounded different. A story they had been told about you no longer matched what they personally remembered. And somewhere between those two realizations, a quiet question appeared: what if the distance between us was never created by what actually happened, but by what someone wanted me to believe happened? That question did not disappear. It followed them into the next hour. It followed them while they looked at their phone. It followed them when they remembered the way you had once tried to explain yourself but seemed unable to find the right words. And then another memory surfaced, one they had almost forgotten. There had been a moment when the third party seemed to know something about your connection that your soulmate had never personally told them. At the time, it was easy to dismiss. Now it felt strangely significant. Don't skip, because what your soulmate discovered next was not a dramatic secret hidden somewhere far away. It was something much more believable, much more personal, and perhaps much harder to ignore: a pattern. The third party had repeatedly appeared whenever communication between you and your soulmate was beginning to improve. A message would be misunderstood. A harmless detail would suddenly become suspicious. Something you said would be repeated with slightly different wording. A private concern would somehow become a bigger issue than it needed to be. None of these moments seemed powerful on their own, but when your soulmate placed them beside each other in their mind, the picture changed. They began seeing the same influence appearing again and again, always at the exact moments when the connection between you was becoming warmer, clearer, or more honest. And that realization brought them to an uncomfortable truth: perhaps they had been reacting not only to you, but also to someone else's interpretation of you. Something important is waiting for you here, because your soulmate's first reaction was not anger. It was regret. Quiet, private regret. They remembered times when you had been judged for things you may never have intended. They remembered conversations where they had entered already expecting disappointment because someone had planted doubt before you were even given the chance to speak. They remembered pulling back from you and then wondering later why the distance felt so unnatural. And in that moment, they began separating what they actually knew about you from what they had merely been told about you. That distinction changed everything. Imagine the silence of someone realizing that several decisions they thought were completely their own might have been influenced by another person's constant commentary. That was the silence your soulmate entered. They did not immediately reach for their phone. They did not announce what they had discovered. Instead, they sat with it. Because once a person recognizes a pattern, it becomes difficult to return to pretending the pattern does not exist. Then came the detail the third party never expected your soulmate to remember. There had been one particular conversation between you and your soulmate where the emotional tone had changed suddenly. You had said something simple, something sincere, and shortly afterward the third party had described your words in a completely different way. Your soulmate had believed that interpretation at the time. But now, replaying your actual words, they realized the interpretation had added meaning that was never there. That was the crack in the story. Not some shocking piece of evidence. Not an impossible revelation. Just one small inconsistency that opened the door to every other question they had avoided asking. Why was someone so invested in how your soulmate understood you? Why did that person always seem more concerned with creating conclusions than encouraging direct conversation? Why did peace between you seem to make them uncomfortable? Your soulmate did not have every answer yet, but they finally had enough clarity to stop accepting every opinion as truth. And this is where the story begins turning in a direction the third party never prepared for. Your soulmate stopped discussing you with them. Quietly. Completely. No announcement. No argument. The next time the third party tried to bring your name into conversation, your soulmate gave them almost nothing. A brief response. A change of subject. A calm silence where there once would have been questions. That silence mattered, because for the first time the third party could no longer tell whether their words were having any influence. The usual emotional reaction did not arrive. The usual uncertainty did not appear. Your soulmate was listening differently now. They were observing. And perhaps most importantly, they were beginning to trust their own experience of you again. Stay till the end, because the next thing your soulmate did was so simple that almost anyone watching from the outside would have missed its importance. They opened an old conversation between the two of you. Not the dramatic messages. Not the complicated ones. They searched for something earlier, something from before outside opinions became so loud. They found a message from you that carried a completely different energy, calm, thoughtful, uncomplicated. And reading it now, they remembered the version of your connection that existed before everything became surrounded by explanations. They remembered how easy it once felt to understand you when nobody else was translating your intentions for them. That memory softened something inside them. Suddenly this was no longer only about exposing interference. It became about recognizing what had been lost underneath it. Your soulmate began wondering whether the connection itself had ever truly disappeared, or whether it had simply been buried beneath too many assumptions. That question stayed with them longer than they expected. Then another realization arrived, quieter but deeper. Every time they had followed someone else's interpretation instead of asking you directly, they had moved one step further away from the truth. And every time they remembered an actual moment with you rather than someone's opinion about you, the emotional picture became clearer. That contrast became impossible to ignore. The third party had expected exposure to create chaos. Instead, it created clarity. They expected your soulmate to confront them, giving them a chance to defend themselves, explain everything, or shift the conversation again. Your soulmate chose something completely different. They decided that the next move would not involve the third party at all. No debate. No request for permission. No need to prove who was right. Their attention turned toward you. That is the part nobody saw coming. Your soulmate began thinking about what they would say if they spoke to you without anyone else's voice in the room. What would they ask? What would they finally admit? Would they tell you they had allowed outside opinions to shape decisions they should have made from their own heart and judgment? Would they apologize for moments when they misunderstood you? Or would they begin with something smaller, something gentle enough to reopen a door without forcing anything? For a while, they could not decide. Then they noticed something about themselves. They were no longer asking whether reconnecting with you would upset the third party. That question had quietly disappeared. In its place was a new one: what feels honest to me now? And my beloved child, that may be the most meaningful shift of all, because real clarity rarely arrives with noise. Sometimes it appears when a person stops asking everyone else what they should feel and finally listens to what their own experiences have been trying to tell them. Your soulmate started recognizing moments they genuinely missed: your humor, your way of noticing little things, the conversations that felt unusually easy, the emotional familiarity that had never been completely replaced by distance. They also remembered the difficult moments, but now they were looking at them with more balance. Not everything had been perfect, and they were no longer pretending it had been. Yet even the imperfect memories felt different when separated from exaggeration. They could finally see where genuine misunderstandings ended and outside interference began. Then, late in that quiet reflection, your soulmate made a decision. They would no longer allow anyone else to carry messages between you. If something needed to be understood, they would ask you. If something sounded strange, they would verify it with you. If they wanted to know what you felt, they would hear it from you, not from someone describing you from the outside. That boundary was the move the third party never expected, because it removed the one position from which interference had been possible. There was no dramatic punishment in it. No revenge. Just directness. Just maturity. Just two people potentially being given the chance to understand each other without a third voice shaping the meaning. And then came the moment your soulmate had been avoiding. Their thumb hovered over your name. For several seconds, they did nothing. They opened the conversation, closed it, then opened it again. They began typing something, erased it, and stared at the empty message field. Something about those few seconds carried more emotion than any dramatic speech could have. Because they were not struggling to find something clever to say. They were trying to decide how honest they were ready to be. The first sentence they considered was simple: "There's something I think I finally understand." They stared at those words. Then another possibility came: "I wish I had asked you directly a long time ago." That one stayed on the screen longer. And just when it seemed they might send it, they stopped again, not because they had changed their mind about you, but because another realization had arrived. Your soulmate did not want this conversation to become another rushed moment filled with half-explanations. If they approached you, they wanted to do it differently this time. No accusations. No assumptions. No outside opinions carried into the room. Just honesty. And that means their next move may not be the loudest move. It may be a carefully chosen message. A calm conversation. A question that finally gives you space to answer for yourself. But whatever form it takes, one thing inside your soulmate has already changed: the third party is no longer being allowed to define the connection. And somewhere tonight, as your soulmate looks again at the words they almost sent, there is one final thought beginning to take shape, a thought connected to something you once said that they misunderstood completely. They have gone back to that old message now. They are reading it differently. And the meaning they are finally seeing inside those words may become the reason they decide exactly what to say to you next. The strangest part was not what your soulmate discovered next, but how familiar the truth suddenly felt once they stopped fighting it. That old message was still glowing on the screen, the same words they had seen many times before, yet this time they were reading them without anyone else's explanation attached. And slowly, almost painfully, they realized something simple: you had not been trying to create distance in that moment. You had been trying to protect the connection from becoming something neither of you would recognize. Your words had been cautious because you cared. Your hesitation had not been rejection. Your silence had not necessarily meant indifference. But somewhere along the way, someone else had taken those quiet details and given them a completely different meaning. Your soulmate sat there longer than they intended, rereading the exchange from beginning to end, noticing where their own tone had changed after talking to the third party, noticing how quickly assumptions had entered a conversation that had once felt natural. And then a thought appeared that made them put the phone down for a moment. What if I had simply asked? What if I had gone directly to you instead of letting uncertainty grow in the spaces where honest conversation should have been? That question carried no blame toward you. In fact, it did the opposite. It made your soulmate begin taking responsibility for their own choices. They could see now that influence only works when someone gives it room, and although the third party had clearly interfered, your soulmate understood that rebuilding anything meaningful would require more than exposing what happened. It would require them to become different in the way they handled your connection from this point forward. Don't skip, because this was where the exposure stopped being about the third party and started becoming something much deeper. Your soulmate quietly made a promise to themselves: if they reached out to you, they would not come carrying another person's opinions. They would not ask questions designed to confirm old suspicions. They would not make you defend yourself against conversations you were never part of. They would listen. Truly listen. And that decision changed the message they were about to send. The sentence they had typed earlier suddenly felt incomplete. "I wish I had asked you directly a long time ago" was honest, but there was something missing from it. Your soulmate wanted you to understand that this was not just another emotional moment they would forget tomorrow. Something had genuinely shifted. So they erased the sentence and began again. This time, the words came slower. "I've been thinking about some things I believed without ever hearing your side." Their thumb hovered over the screen. They read the sentence once. Twice. 3 times. There was vulnerability in it, because sending those words meant admitting something they had avoided admitting even to themselves. It meant acknowledging that they may have misunderstood you. It meant opening a door without knowing exactly what would be waiting on the other side. Yet something about that uncertainty no longer frightened them. It felt honest. And honesty, after so much confusion, felt unexpectedly peaceful. But just as they were about to continue typing, their phone lit up with another message. It was from the third party. The timing almost seemed unbelievable. Your soulmate stared at the notification without opening it. In the past, they would have responded immediately. They would have wondered what the third party knew, what they wanted to say, whether there was another warning or opinion they needed to consider. This time, your soulmate simply looked at the screen and felt something different: distance. Not angry distance. Not bitterness. Just the quiet recognition that this person no longer needed access to every thought, every doubt, every decision connected to you. For the first time, your soulmate understood that protecting a connection does not always mean making grand declarations. Sometimes it means deciding who no longer gets a vote in something deeply personal. They turned the notification aside and returned to your conversation. That tiny choice would have seemed ordinary to anyone watching, but inside your soulmate it felt enormous. The third party had spent so much time expecting your soulmate to look toward them whenever uncertainty appeared. Now uncertainty was leading your soulmate toward you instead. Stay till the end, because what happened after that was the moment your soulmate finally understood why the interference had lasted as long as it did. They began scrolling through older conversations with the third party, not searching for proof, but looking for patterns they had missed. And there it was again. Whenever your soulmate spoke warmly about you, the response would become subtly doubtful. Whenever they mentioned a peaceful interaction with you, some concern would suddenly be raised. Whenever your soulmate considered giving the connection another chance, they were reminded of old misunderstandings instead of being encouraged to seek new clarity. None of it had looked dramatic at the time. That was exactly why it had been effective. The interference had rarely sounded like interference. It had sounded like advice. Like concern. Like someone simply trying to help. But genuine support usually brings a person closer to their own judgment, not further away from it. Your soulmate could finally see the difference. They remembered one conversation in particular where they had said, "Maybe I should just talk to them." The third party had immediately answered with reasons why waiting might be better. At the time, your soulmate accepted that advice. Now they wondered what might have happened if they had followed their first instinct instead. That memory stung, but only for a moment, because another realization followed quickly behind it. The past could not be rewritten, but the next decision was still theirs. Something important is waiting for you, because this was the exact moment your soulmate stopped asking themselves what had been lost and started asking what could still be repaired. They looked at your name again. They thought about how easily another week could pass. Another month. More silence. More assumptions. More missed opportunities disguised as caution. And suddenly, waiting felt less safe than honesty. Your soulmate returned to the unfinished message. "I've been thinking about some things I believed without ever hearing your side." They added another sentence, "I don't want anyone else speaking for either of us anymore." This time they did not erase it. They sat with those words and felt something settle inside them. Not certainty about the future. Not certainty about how you would respond. Something healthier than certainty, readiness. Readiness to know the truth even if the truth was complicated. Readiness to hear what you had experienced. Readiness to admit where they had been wrong. Readiness to stop protecting themselves with assumptions. Yet there was still one thing holding them back from pressing send. Your soulmate remembered a specific moment when you had tried to tell them something important, and they had shut the conversation down too quickly. The memory came back with unexpected detail: the time of day, the sound of the room, the way your words had slowed when you realized they were no longer truly listening. Back then, your soulmate had interpreted your reaction as frustration. Now they wondered whether it had actually been disappointment. Not disappointment because you were trying to control them, but because you had recognized that someone else's opinion had already arrived before your truth had been given a chance. That thought changed the emotional weight of everything. Your soulmate suddenly imagined what the connection may have felt like from your side. Being misunderstood is difficult enough. Being misunderstood because someone else repeatedly shaped the story before you could speak for yourself is something different. And instead of becoming defensive, your soulmate softened. They began understanding why you may have pulled back at certain moments. Why you may have stopped explaining. Why your energy may have changed. Sometimes people stop repeating themselves not because they do not care, but because they realize they are being heard through a filter they cannot control. That possibility stayed with your soulmate. And then the third party messaged again. This time the notification preview revealed your name. Your soulmate's expression changed immediately. The message was not threatening, dramatic, or extreme. It was something far more revealing because of how ordinary it sounded, another suggestion about what your soulmate should think about you. Another interpretation. Another attempt to place meaning on your actions. But now the pattern was visible, and once visible, it could not be unseen. Your soulmate did something the third party never expected. They did not argue. They did not expose everything they had noticed. They did not give the third party a chance to turn the moment into another long conversation. They answered with one calm sentence: if I need to understand something about them, I'll ask them myself. Then they placed the phone down. No drama followed inside them. Only relief. The kind of relief that arrives when a boundary has finally been spoken aloud. For the third party, those words may have sounded simple. But beneath them was an entire change in direction. The influence was losing its place. The triangle of assumptions was being replaced by something much more direct. And your soulmate could feel it. Their next thought surprised even them: I should have done this sooner. Yet instead of allowing regret to consume the moment, they used it as momentum. They returned to your message once more. This time they added, I'm not asking you to explain everything right now. I just want a conversation that belongs to us. That sentence changed the entire tone. It was not demanding. It was not asking you to erase what happened. It was an invitation into something cleaner than what had existed before. Your soulmate read the full message from beginning to end. Their heart was not racing because they expected some magical outcome. It was because honesty always carries a certain vulnerability when silence has lasted too long. They knew you might need time. They knew you might have questions. They knew the connection could not simply return to an earlier version of itself, because both of you had changed through what happened. But perhaps that was not a bad thing. Maybe the goal was never to go backward. Maybe the opportunity was to create something more mature than what existed before, something where questions were asked directly, where concerns were not carried through other people, where both of you were allowed to speak for yourselves. Your soulmate's finger moved closer to the send button. Then they paused one final time. Not because of the third party. That influence was already weakening. They paused because another memory had surfaced, and this one was different from all the others. It was a sentence you had once said so casually that your soulmate had almost forgotten it: I never needed you to choose sides. I just wanted you to know me for yourself. The words returned with startling clarity. Your soulmate closed their eyes for a moment. Suddenly, they understood why that sentence had stayed somewhere inside them all this time. You had not been asking them to fight anyone. You had been asking them not to outsource their understanding of you. And now, after everything, they were finally ready to do exactly that. The message was sent. No dramatic music. No instant answer. Just a small confirmation beneath the text showing that it had left their phone and entered the quiet space between you. Your soulmate stared at the screen, feeling strangely calm. The third party had expected exposure to make your soulmate more dependent on explanations, more confused, more emotionally reactive. Instead, it had pushed them toward independence, honesty, and direct communication. That was the last thing anyone interfering with the connection had expected. But the story did not end with the message being sent. In some ways, that was only the beginning. Because several minutes later, something happened that your soulmate was not prepared for. The screen changed. Your conversation opened again. There was movement beneath your name. And when your soulmate saw what appeared there, the calm they had been holding shifted into something much deeper, because it suggested that you had not ignored the message, and what you were about to say might finally reveal what had really been happening on your side all along. What appeared beneath your name was only a small sign that you were responding, but to your soulmate it carried the weight of every conversation that had been interrupted by assumptions. For a few seconds, the words began to form, then disappeared. They appeared again, then stopped. Your soulmate watched without touching the screen, suddenly realizing that whatever you were trying to say was not easy for you either. That detail mattered. Until this moment, they had been so focused on what they needed to admit that they had not fully considered how much you might have been holding back. Maybe you had written messages and erased them too. Maybe you had wanted to explain yourself but feared your words would once again be carried outside the connection and interpreted by someone who was never meant to be part of it. Maybe there were moments when you chose silence not because your feelings disappeared, but because silence felt safer than being misunderstood again. Your soulmate leaned back and waited. No second message. No attempt to hurry you. For perhaps the first time in this entire story, they were allowing you to decide the pace. And then your reply arrived. It was shorter than they expected. There were no dramatic accusations. No long explanation. Just a few careful words. I've wanted to have that conversation for a long time. I just stopped believing there was room for my side. Your soulmate read the sentence once and became completely still. Then they read it again, slower. The words were gentle, but the truth inside them landed deeply. You had not disappeared because you had nothing to say. You had stepped back because you no longer felt certain your words had somewhere safe to land. That realization did something unexpected to your soulmate. It removed the last excuse they had been quietly carrying. They could no longer tell themselves that the distance had simply happened. They could see now that the connection had been shaped by choices, some made by the third party, some made by them, and perhaps some made by you in response to what you were experiencing. And strangely, seeing that clearly did not make the situation feel hopeless. It made it feel reparable, because anything created through patterns could potentially be changed through new ones. Don't skip, because the next decision your soulmate made showed just how much their thinking had changed. Their instinct was to explain everything immediately. They wanted to tell you what had been uncovered, which conversations they now understood differently, which comments from the third party had finally stopped making sense. Their fingers moved quickly across the screen, forming a long message. Then they stopped. They read what they had written and recognized an old habit hiding inside it. They were still trying to control how the story was understood. So they deleted almost all of it. In its place, they wrote something much simpler: "Then I want to hear your side without interrupting it." Your response did not come immediately. The silence stretched just long enough for your soulmate to wonder whether they had said too much or too little. But this time they refused to fill the silence with fear. They reminded themselves that direct communication meant allowing space, not demanding instant reassurance. And when your next message finally arrived, something changed. You did not begin with the third party. You began with a memory. You reminded your soulmate of a day when the two of you had been talking easily, when something between you had felt almost effortless. You had mentioned a small plan, something ordinary the two of you might do together someday. Your soulmate remembered smiling when you said it. Yet by that evening, their tone had changed completely. They became distant. Guarded. You had never understood why. Your soulmate knew exactly why now. That had been one of the evenings when the third party had spoken to them privately. Not about anything clearly harmful. Just enough questions to create uncertainty. Are you sure they meant it that way? Do you really know what they want? What if you're reading too much into this? Your soulmate remembered how reasonable those questions had sounded. But now they also remembered what happened afterward. Instead of asking you what you meant, they started responding to possibilities that existed only in their imagination. Your warm conversation became colder even though you had done nothing differently. Reading your memory of that day from your perspective made the pattern painfully clear. You had watched the atmosphere shift without being told why. You had assumed you had done something wrong. And because your soulmate never explained the outside conversation influencing them, you were left searching your own actions for an answer that was never there. Something important is waiting for you here, because your soulmate finally understood that interference does not always destroy a connection through one giant event. Sometimes it creates dozens of small moments where two people slowly stop trusting what they experience directly. One person becomes cautious. The other senses the caution and becomes cautious too. Then both begin protecting themselves from a misunderstanding neither one fully understands. That was the cycle your soulmate could now see. And seeing it made them determined not to repeat it. They responded to your memory with something you had probably waited a long time to hear: you didn't do anything wrong that day. I let someone else's questions become louder than what I had actually experienced with you. After sending it, your soulmate felt exposed in a new way. It would have been easier to blame everything on the third party. It would have been easier to present themselves as someone who had simply been manipulated and therefore carried no responsibility. But that was not what they wanted anymore. If this conversation was going to become a genuine turning point, honesty had to include their own mistakes. Your reply took longer this time. Then came a sentence your soulmate had not expected: "Thank you for saying that. I questioned myself for a long time because of moments like that." Those words softened something in them. They imagined all the small occasions when you may have gone home replaying a conversation, wondering why warmth suddenly became distance, wondering whether you had spoken incorrectly, wondering what had changed. And now your soulmate knew that sometimes the answer had not been hidden inside your behavior at all. It had been happening somewhere else, in conversations you could not hear. They wanted to apologize immediately, but even the apology needed to be different from what they might have offered in the past. Not, "I'm sorry if you felt that way." Not, "I'm sorry everything became confusing." Those phrases created distance from responsibility. Instead, they wrote, "I'm sorry I made you question yourself instead of asking you directly." Simple. Specific. Real. Your soulmate stared at the message after sending it and felt something release. For so long, they had imagined that admitting fault would make them smaller in your eyes. Now they were beginning to understand that accountability could actually make conversation safer. And your next response confirmed it. "That's all I wanted back then, to be asked." For words at the end stayed in your soulmate's mind, to be asked. Not blindly trusted. Not automatically defended. Not chosen over everyone else. Asked. Given an opportunity to speak for yourself. The third party had spent so much time framing this connection as though your soulmate had to choose between loyalty to one person and loyalty to another. Yet you had never demanded that choice. You had only wanted a relationship where your own intentions were not decided without you. That difference suddenly felt enormous. Stay till the end, because while the two of you were finally having the conversation that should have happened much earlier, the third party noticed that something had changed. Another message appeared on your soulmate's phone. Then another. The wording was casual, but the timing was obvious. Questions about what your soulmate was doing. Whether everything was okay. Whether they wanted to talk. Your soulmate looked at the notifications and understood something important. The old version of them would have interrupted this conversation with you to respond. They would have divided their attention. They might even have shared part of what you were saying, allowing another person to analyze it before they had finished hearing you. This time they turned their phone notifications off and returned to you. That action was small, almost invisible, yet it represented one of the strongest boundaries they had made. Your conversation would remain your conversation. No screenshots. No summaries. No outside interpretation afterward. What you said would be heard in the place where you intended it to be heard. Your soulmate did not announce this promise to you because they understood that trust is not rebuilt through impressive declarations. It is rebuilt when behavior quietly changes and stays changed. Then you shared another detail. Months earlier, someone close to the third party had casually repeated something about you that only your soulmate should have known. You had noticed it immediately but said nothing. At first, you wondered whether your soulmate had intentionally shared private details. Later, when similar things happened again, you became increasingly careful about what you revealed. This was why your conversations had gradually lost some of their emotional depth. You had not stopped caring. You had stopped feeling certain that what you shared would remain between the two of you. Your soulmate felt their stomach sink, not from fear, but from recognition. They remembered discussing personal details about your connection with the third party because they thought they were asking for advice. At the time, it seemed harmless. But they had never considered how exposed you might feel if those details traveled beyond that conversation. Suddenly another piece of the puzzle settled into place. Your increasing privacy had been interpreted by the third party as evidence that you were hiding something. In reality, you may simply have been responding to the fact that your privacy no longer felt protected. The misunderstanding had fed itself. Your soulmate typed slowly now, "I understand why you became careful. I should have protected what was ours instead of discussing it elsewhere." There was no defense attached. No explanation about good intentions. They were learning that intentions mattered, but impact mattered too. You replied with something that surprised them, "I don't need you to punish anyone for it." Your soulmate stared at that sentence. You continued, "I just need anything between us to actually stay between us." And there it was again, the same quiet truth beneath everything. You were not asking for conflict. You were asking for boundaries. You were not demanding that someone be defeated. You were asking that the connection finally be given room to exist without constant interference. Your soulmate realized that the most unexpected response to exposure was not confrontation at all. It was refusing to continue the conditions that had allowed interference to happen. That meant less drama, not more. Fewer explanations to outsiders. More direct questions between you. More privacy. More patience. More responsibility. These were not glamorous changes, but they were real ones. And perhaps that was precisely why the third party had never expected them. Dramatic conflict could be answered with more drama. Quiet maturity was much harder to disrupt. Your soulmate looked again at the muted notifications and felt no desire to reopen that door tonight. Instead, they asked you a question they had been afraid to ask for a long time. When did you first feel like you couldn't trust the space between us anymore? The response did not appear quickly. The typing indicator came and went several times. Your soulmate could sense that you were deciding how much truth the moment could hold. Then you answered with a date. Not an explanation. Just a date. Your soulmate recognized it instantly. It was the day of a conversation they had almost completely forgotten, a day they had assumed meant very little. But to you, apparently, it had changed something important. Your soulmate scrolled backward through old messages until they reached that date. The conversation seemed ordinary at first. A few jokes. A small misunderstanding. Then a sudden shift. They read further. And there, sitting unnoticed for all this time, was something that made the entire interference pattern even clearer. You had asked your soulmate a direct question that day, "Did someone tell you I said that?" Your soulmate had answered, "Why does that matter?" They remembered the exchange now. At the time, they had thought you were avoiding the real issue. But reading it with everything they understood tonight, they saw something completely different. You had already sensed that another voice had entered the connection. You had been trying to find out whether the words being attributed to you had actually come from you. Instead of answering your question, your soulmate became defensive. And the conversation ended soon afterward. Your soulmate felt a wave of regret, but they did not stay there. They wrote, "You knew something was happening before I did, didn't you?" Your response came back, "I didn't know exactly what was happening. I just knew I kept having to explain things I had never actually said." That sentence became another turning point. Your soulmate suddenly understood the exhaustion beneath your old silence. Imagine being asked to defend meanings you never intended, conversations you never had, motives you never claimed. Eventually, explaining yourself would begin to feel endless. So you stopped. And the third party had interpreted that silence as confirmation. The loop had been almost perfect: distort something, watch you withdraw, then point to your withdrawal as proof that the distortion was correct. Your soulmate could finally see how easily two people can lose each other when indirect communication becomes stronger than direct experience. But instead of becoming consumed with what had gone wrong, they asked a different question: what would make this feel different now? Your response was almost immediate. Consistency. One word. No dramatic condition. No impossible demand. Consistency. Your soulmate understood exactly what you meant. One conversation could open the door, but it could not rebuild everything. One apology could acknowledge the past, but it could not guarantee the future. If something between you was going to become healthier, the proof would come through ordinary choices repeated over time: asking instead of assuming, listening instead of reacting, protecting privacy, keeping boundaries, refusing to let outsiders define what happens inside the connection. Your soulmate felt unexpectedly hopeful because for the first time, the path forward was not mysterious. It might not be easy, but it was clear. And then they made the move the third party truly never expected. They did not send an angry message. They did not demand an explanation. They did not announce that they had uncovered everything. They opened the conversation with the third party and wrote only this: I appreciate the times you believed you were helping, but anything concerning my connection with them will be handled directly between us from now on. I'm not discussing private details anymore. Your soulmate read it carefully before sending. The message did not accuse. It did not invite debate. It simply closed a door that should never have been left open so widely. Then they sent it. The response came quickly. A question. Then an explanation. Then an attempt to clarify past intentions. Your soulmate did not engage. They had already said what needed to be said. A boundary loses its purpose when it becomes an endless negotiation. So they returned to your conversation. And what they found waiting there made them smile for the first time that night. You had sent another message: I don't expect us to fix everything tonight. A second message followed. But this is the first conversation in a long time that actually feels like ours. Your soulmate read those words and understood the significance immediately. Nothing had magically returned to normal. There was still history. Still uncertainty. Still things neither of you had explained. But there was also something that had been missing for a long time: a clean beginning. Not a return to the past, a different way forward. Your soulmate typed, then maybe we don't fix everything tonight. Maybe we just stop making the same mistake tomorrow. You answered with a small, simple agreement. And for a moment, the conversation softened. You spoke about ordinary things. Something funny that happened earlier. A song one of you remembered. A tiny detail about your day. Those ordinary exchanges mattered more than your soulmate expected because they reminded both of you that the connection had never been built entirely from dramatic moments. Its deepest strength had often lived in the simple ones: the ease, the familiarity, the feeling of being understood without having to perform. Yet just when your soulmate thought the night had revealed everything it needed to reveal, you sent one more message. This one was different. "There's something else you should know," you wrote. Your soulmate felt their attention sharpen, but they did not rush you. The typing indicator appeared again. "I never told you why I finally stepped away completely." Your soulmate stared at the screen. They had always assumed they knew the reason. They thought the accumulated misunderstandings had simply become too much. But your next sentence suggested there had been one specific moment, one final incident connected directly to the third party that your soulmate had never known about. And whatever happened that day had not only convinced you to become silent. It had convinced you that staying close might keep the cycle alive. Your soulmate waited as your next message began to appear, realizing that the truth they thought had already been exposed was still incomplete, and the detail you were finally ready to reveal might explain the one decision about your connection they had misunderstood most of all.